The following is a sponsored program paid for by First Alliance Credit Union. Welcome to Good Money Moves, featuring Jenna Taubel from First Alliance Credit Union and Andy Brownell. Here's Andy Brownell on Rochester's News Talk, 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Welcome to Good Money Moves. I'm Andy Brownell with Jenna Taubel, AVP of Marketing at First Alliance Credit Union. Hi, Jenna.
Hey, Andy.
Last week, we talked with Brent Rempe, who's the president and CEO of First Alliance Credit Union, about the advantages of credit unions, the history of them. That was a great talk. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, it's
always
great to talk about credit unions.
Well, it's such a rich history. That's what I really like about it.
Yes.
So what's the Good Money Moves topic this week?
Yeah, so today we are delving into a topic that has been affecting everyone's purchasing power, and that is the dirty word, inflation.
Yes.
I like to refer to inflation as the silent thief of your money, because it just kind of gradually erodes the value of your savings and investments and your paycheck, like, over time. So in this episode, I want to explore, really what inflation is. It's on a high level, what causes it, how it impacts your finances. So kind of like, why should you care about this? And then also talk through a couple of strategies that you as a normal consumer could implement to help minimize some of the effects that inflation might have on your paycheck and your budget.
Great. I like to call it a hidden tax.
Yes, that's another great way to describe it.
Interesting topic. I'm sure we'll get into this deep. Well, I guess basic. Let's do the most basic thing we can talk about. What is inflation?
Yeah, so inflation might seem like a really abstract concept. Well, it is kind of an abstract concept, but it does affect very tangible things in your everyday life. So inflation is really just the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising, aka getting more expensive. So when inflation is high, what happens is it erodes the purchasing power of your money really quickly. So instead of gradual over time, high inflation is like this rapid erosion. And it really just diminishes the value of your savings, your fixed income, right? Because wages can't keep up with the rising costs, essentially. And now this can really disproportionately affect lower income households, which ultimately leads to some decreased standard of living, but we can dig into that later. But for now, just to kind of make sure that everybody really understands this concept on like a simple level, I have a really, really basic example to walk through. So let's imagine that your favorite candy bar that you always buy for $1, right? Over time, that price goes up to $1.50, right? That's inflation. Yep. And it's this gradual increase in the prices of goods and services over time. So your $1 today doesn't buy you as much candy as it used to tomorrow because the prices have gone up due to inflation, right? So it's a really simple idea of how that works.
Or if you went to the grocery store and you bought $100 worth of groceries.
Right.
And now that same $100 is going to cost you $125 or $130.
Exactly. Yeah. So your paycheck just doesn't feel like it goes as far as it used to.
Right.
That is the effects of inflation. And the current U.S. inflation rate is about 3.5% for the last 12-month period through like March 2024. So that's high. So to your point, basically, if you bought something in 2018 for $100, that same item or items would now cost you like $135, essentially. Fast math, right? But that's a lot of money. That's a big increase. And so people are definitely feeling that pinch.
And that's even a bit misleading as well, because when you say 3.5% over the 12-month period, the previous 12 months, it went up close to 10%.
Yes.
So then you do the 2 years, you're edging up total, close to 15% overall.
Yeah.
And
It's record
Ouch.
levels of inflation, right? I mean, that's
Yeah,
why
well,
we're
in the
talking
last
about it.
40 years. Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Since I was a
Since the
kid.
70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you want to talk about scary inflation, go back then. Okay. Obviously, we've all felt the effects of this.
hmm
So, what causes it, Jenna?
Yeah. So inflation happens for a variety of reasons, like when there's more money circulating in the economy or when the cost of making goods goes up. But in essence, and this again is at a high level, it gets more complicated, but we're going to keep it high level today.
Okay.
So there's essentially two types of inflation that everyone I think really needs to know about, and it kind of comes down to a little bit of basic supply and demand. But one term you might hear talked about when you're hearing or reading something about inflation is something called demand pull inflation. And this is essentially when there's a lot of demand for goods and services in the economy, right? This is when people have money to spend because they maybe got a raise or there's some kind of windfall they received or there's just a general boom in the economy. So when demand for goods and services is higher, right? People are out there spending, than what the economy, and it's higher than what the economy can really produce. That's when you see prices go up. So this happens because businesses can charge more when there's higher demand. So demand pull inflation is really like that tug of war between how much stuff people want to buy and how much stuff the economy can make. So if people want more than what's available, the price gets pushed up essentially, right?
Sure. And we hit that classically during the pandemic because you had all these people not working and goods not being produced.
Exactly.
And we were all receiving checks from the government to try to stimulate the economy. And so you had this huge demand being built up by the money supply, and nobody's at work yet to produce the products, which creates the classic shortage and inflation.
Exactly. And that it was a big component of why we're experiencing what we're experiencing now. But the other piece of that is another term that you'll hear referred to, cost push inflation. So think about what happens when it costs more for businesses to make their products. So like maybe the price of raw materials goes up or wages increase, right? When the cost of making things goes up, businesses usually pass that cost on to consumers by raising prices. And they do this to maintain profit margins. So cost push inflation is kind of like this domino effect. So instead of a tug of war, it's the domino. So when the cost of production goes up, businesses raise prices, and then consumers really end up paying more for those goods and services. So again, keeping it high level, there's so much nuance that can go into these, and there's other ways to look at inflation, but these are probably the two most common that you're going to hear about and that you maybe even learned about to some degree in school if you were paying attention in economics class. So really just to kind of give a quick recap. So that demand pull inflation is driven by too much demand chasing too few goods. Cost push inflation happens when the cost of making goods goes up. So to your point earlier, the U.S. economy is actually currently experiencing a combination of these two. And again, not experienced since like the 1970s levels of inflation. And really, again, to your point earlier, that's really the recent surge in inflation is truly those lingering effects, at least in part by those supply chain issues that we ran into, the pent up consumer demand and from the economic stimulus from the pandemic, all of this stuff is kind of compounding and continuing to play out through inflation.
Right. And you're right, it's a combination. The one triggered the other.
Mm-hmm.
And as employers tried to bring employees back to work, they found themselves having to pay higher wages, which resulted in the cost push.
Yeah.
Oh, what a mess. Okay, all good information. Earlier, you mentioned that inflation affects Purchasing power. How else can it affect our finances?
Yeah. So inflation affects your finances in really four key ways. So purchasing power, which we've talked about, right? Over time, inflation reduces the value of money, meaning you can buy fewer goods and services with that same amount of currency. But it also impacts your savings. And this is why. So inflation eats away at the real value of your savings. So if you've got $100, I mean, it's not incredibly different than the idea of purchasing power, right? If you've got $100 sitting in your savings account and you're saving that for a rainy day, well, if it's not earning a significant amount of interest and it's just sitting there, and you're not adding to it in any way, it's not going to keep up with inflation. So your $100 that you stowed away, I'll go back to 2018, now you want to use it to pay for something in 2024, well, you're $35 short, essentially, right? So especially, so if interest rates on savings accounts are lower than inflation, you're going to have a significant impact on your savings.
It's a lot more insidious, too, because you don't notice it as it's happening.
Correct. Yeah. So that emergency fund's not going to go as far. That's why you have to kind of keep building it up over time. Investments, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but it can impact investments as well. So particularly like fixed income securities like bonds are impacted by inflation. But I think the biggest thing that most people feel, right, this is where it really gets everybody, is that wage erosion. So if wage growth does not keep pace with inflation, workers' earning power diminishes, which leads to a couple of different things. So it can lead to a decrease in standard of living. So workers are going to find it more difficult to maintain their basic standard of living that they've been accustomed to, because that real value of their wages has decreased, right? Kind of, again, going back to that purchasing power, the ability to use those wages to pay for things and grow your savings is diminishing. And I don't think anybody'd argue about this. It increases financial strain overall, right? So wage erosion can really lead to increased financial strain for people, really forcing individuals, families to cut back on expenses or start dipping into their savings to make ends meet if inflation is moving too quickly.
But it also can hit the businesses that same way, because if they cannot recoup their higher expenses, their margins shrink, because there are some products you just have a difficult time raising the price too much for. People just will stop buying it.
Exactly. Yeah. 100%. And the third component that I think this wage erosion from inflation comes in is it really does increase income inequality overall. That wage erosion can really exacerbate the situation, right? So as lower income workers are often kind of that more vulnerable population to these inflationary pressures, and they're going to be the ones that struggle to keep up with these rising costs of living. They're the ones that are going to first experience that standard of living decrease. They're the ones that are going to really feel that financial strain first, because they were already kind of living minimally, and with those low wages, when you only make $2,000 a month and costs go up even 3.5%, right? I mean, what do you do at that point? They don't have a lot of wiggle room.
Think about rents. Rents have gone up way faster than 3.5%.
Oh yeah, don't even get me. That's a whole nother show, Andy.
Yeah, but that really hits those folks at the lower end of the pay scale.
It does.
Immediately, they have a hard time keeping a roof over their head at that point.
100%, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll take a break. We're talking about inflation. What a cheery subject, Jenna. We'll be back with more of Good Money Moves in just a moment on News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Good Money Moves continues in moments with Andy Brownell and Jenna Taubel from First Alliance Credit Union. This is News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 FM. We're talking good money moves with Andy Brownell and Jenna Taubel from First Alliance Credit Union on Rochester's News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Welcome back. More of Good Money Moves. Jenna Taubel with First Alliance Credit Union with us, of course. And the topic today is inflation. Mm-hmm. And earlier, we talked about how it affects lower income households more. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could extrapolate on that a little bit, Jenna.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, by definition, low income households have less money to begin with, right? So they might not have the savings or the investments to help them kind of cope with rising prices. So when inflation happens, it really hits them a lot harder. And they're going to have to spend a larger portion of their income on basic necessities, food, rent, like you mentioned earlier, utilities. Imagine if you were already struggling to make ends meet a little bit, and then suddenly everything starts costing more and more. You're going to have to start making some really tough choices, not necessarily just buying cheaper groceries, but, even being able to afford groceries at all in some cases, or, having to cut back on other essentials just to balance, these increasing prices across all of your bills, right? So, lower income households, they just don't typically have access to the same financial tools that wealthier people have to protect themselves from inflation. And that's not to say people that have higher incomes don't also feel the impact of inflation. But if you own your home, you're already protecting yourself to some degree from the impacts of inflation. So, and also, you think about if you've got investments or in assets like stocks or like real estate, like I mentioned, those things increase in value over time, and they can really actually help offset the effects of inflation. So if you don't have that to rely on, that's really hitting your bottom line really quickly. And so, basically inflation just really reduces the purchasing power of money, meaning you can buy fewer things with the same amount. And it hits those low income households a lot harder because they do have that less money to begin with and those fewer resources available at their disposal to cope with these rising prices without having to rely on more debt or taking what little savings they have left to cover the gaps.
Yeah, it's a monster for the.
It is.
You think gasoline prices go up, harder to get to work.
Yeah.
Your wages go up a little bit, but don't come close to covering the cost of rent as it rises.
Yeah.
And if your food purchases go up 25, 30% like they have, it could be a downward cycle really, really fast for folks. And you see, I know Channel 1, our local food shelf, they've seen an explosion in the demand for their services because of this.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So how can families deal with it? Or at least try to offset the impact of inflation on their monthly budgets?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, while you can't really truly negate the effects of inflation, there are a few things you should be doing to just try to maintain a healthier financial situation overall. And some of this, and this is all things you could be doing regardless of the inflationary environment, but it's especially important when you're dealing with rapidly rising costs. So, number one thing, budgeting wisely. So, families, they really need to plan their spending, keep track of their income, their expenses, make that budget to make sure that you can cover all your needs first, food, rent, or your mortgage, utilities, transportation, like those basics, and then worry about savings and leisure, right? Savings is important, but savings isn't going to do you any good if you don't have a roof over your head and food in your stomach and a way to get to work. So saving money is, like I said, it's an important aspect of making good money moves, right? We talk about it all the time. So if you do have the opportunity to still save a portion of your income regularly, as you need to, this way, especially in a time where inflation is maybe at more normal levels, if and when prices start to go up rapidly, you will have that extra money to rely on to start covering some of those increasing costs without having to necessarily sacrifice some of those other needs, or even worse, turning to credit cards and then accumulating excessive debt just to try to stay afloat. I kind of mentioned this a couple times in the show, but having investments, it can be a really good way to combat some inflation. So if you've already got some money saved in your savings, start looking in how you can invest your money wisely, to really help grow and even maybe beat inflation if your investments are doing really good. Wouldn't that be great? And then again, just shopping smart, taking time to find those deals and discounts so that when you are out shopping for those necessities, that you aren't spending more than you have to on those things, clothes, other food, gadgets, whatever it is that you need to keep your household running. Just take time to do some comparison pricing before you buy. But watch out for shrinkflation. We talked about that in an episode previously. That is one that, again, comparison pricing. Well, you'll catch on to that. But you are going to have to adjust your spending. It is an unfortunate part of inflation, but it's also a little bit what inflation is designed to do, right? Because if prices are rising because of demand, if you stop spending, in theory, inflation will slow down. So you might have to, eat out less, find cheaper alternatives for some of the things you like to buy regularly, cut out some of the, if you like to go to the movies weekly, you might have to cut back on that. If, these are just kind of basic money management things, but they still matter in an inflationary environment. So, and lastly, if you're really, really struggling, you might have to just take on some additional jobs to earn more to keep up. We talked, I think, in an episode a couple of weeks ago about starting side hustles. So you might have to start a side hustle or find odd jobs you can do for your neighbors. Anything to help kind of bring in a little bit of extra income to help cover those gaps from what you were making before and what those costs have now risen to.
All good advice, yeah. We're talking about inflation, how to cope with inflation, specifically with Jenna Taubel with First Alliance Credit Union. It is Good Money Moves. We'll be back in just a moment. News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Good Money Moves continues in moments with Andy Brownell and Jenna Taubel from First Alliance Credit Union. This is News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 FM. We're talking good money moves with Andy Brownell and Jenna Taubel from First Alliance Credit Union on Rochester's News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Good Money Moves continues. Jenna Taubel, I'm Andy Brownell, Jenna with First Alliance Credit Union, and we've been talking about inflation, what causes it, and what you can do about it. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I noticed that we really haven't talked much about is using a credit card to cover some of the increased costs. Is that even something we should consider?
Yeah, that's not a recommended good money move. Using your credit cards to cover increasing costs because of inflation is actually a really risky thing to do, and it's probably not the best solution if you're already struggling to pay your bills. And here's why. So there's interest charges on credit cards. So when you use a credit card, you are borrowing money. So if you don't pay that balance off in full by the due date, you're going to be charged interest. And over time, that interest adds up, and it actually just makes your purchases even more expensive than the inflation already was.
And guess what? During times of inflation, the interest rates are usually higher as well.
Significantly. So yeah, not for that reason alone, but it's not recommended. But also, I mean, you think just about general debt accumulation. If you're relying too much on credit cards to cover your increasing costs, you're just going to lead to this debt that's piling up. And again, if you can't pay that balance off in full each month, you're going to end up carrying balances from month to month and accruing not only the interest, but all that debt on top of it. And pretty soon you're going to get yourself stuck in this cycle of debt that you can't get out of, which then leads to more financial stress, right? So juggling credit card payments along with all these other expenses that you were already struggling to afford is going to cause even further financial stress for yourself and your family. So it really is important to live within your means and not rely on credit cards to make ends meet. Again, I would just say, if instead of turning to credit cards, it seems like a really easy and convenient solution. But really right now, families really need to focus on budgeting, saving what they can, finding ways to increase income to really offset the effects of inflation as much as possible. Again, you're never going to negate it. It's unfortunately unescapable, but there are things you can do to set yourself up a little bit better financially. And using credit cards sparingly and paying off the balance in full each month is fine. If you can afford to pay it off in full each month, go ahead and use it. It's going to build your credit history. If you've got rewards cards, you might even get a little bonus for that, but it's really important to avoid relying on them as a solution to financial challenges that are caused by inflation.
And you've pointed out that in the past that it's 90% of credit card users do not pay off their balances every month.
Yeah.
It's a really small percentage that are able to do that.
It's true.
Because it takes more than just the money to do it. It takes the discipline to do it as well.
It does. Yeah.
Good information. Actually, fantastic stuff. So thanks, Jenna.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a topic, if you get me going, we could be here for hours.
Yeah, we talk so high level at this. This gets so much more complex and deep than what we even covered today, for sure.
So if you wish to learn more about inflation and things you can do to weather the storm, as they put it, where can I find out more, Jenna?
Yeah, as always, I encourage our listeners to visit our website, firstalliancecu.com. You can subscribe to our blog. We release new financial tips and advice there every week. You can listen to past episodes of this show at firstalliancecu.com/podcast or on krocnews.com. You can also subscribe to Good Money Moves on Apple and Spotify podcasts. And if you love our show, leave us a review. We'd love to know what you think. And of course, I strongly encourage you to reach out to the team at First Alliance Credit Union. They're here to help you start making good money moves today.
That's First Alliance Credit Union, federally insured by NCUA and an equal housing lender. Jenna, thank you so much. I look forward to doing this again next week.
Absolutely.
We'll have another episode of Good Money Moves right here on News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 FM.